In the fall of 1971, a Kansas City company called Rival Manufacturing rolled a squat little ceramic-lined cooker out onto the floor of the National Housewares Show in Chicago. It wasn't new technology. It was a rebuilt version of a device called the Naxon Beanery, an appliance an inventor named Irving Naxon had patented back in 1940 and could never quite get anyone to buy. Rival slapped a fresh coat of avocado green and harvest gold paint on it, wrote up a booklet of recipes tested by their own home economists, and gave it a new name, the Crock-Pot. In its first year on shelves, it brought in $2 million. By 1975, that number had climbed past $93 million. Somewhere in the middle of that boom, a kitchen appliance that most people assumed was a passing fad quietly rewired how an entire generation of American families ate dinner. One dish on this countdown is the reason so many home cooks trusted the pot in the first place, and it isn't the one most people expect. Stick around because we're saving it for last. Subscribe now, and let's count down 25 crock-pot dinners that filled 1970s dinner tables and then disappeared almost completely. 25. Crock-Pot baked bean. This is the dish that never really left the crock-pot's lineage because it's practically what the appliance was invented for in the first place. Soak dried navy beans overnight, then drain them into the pot with diced salt pork, molasses, brown sugar, chopped onion, and just enough water to cover everything. Cover it, set it low, and walk away for most of a full day. What came out the other side was a pot of beans gone deep amber, thick with syrup instead of watery broth, holding their shape instead of turning to mush. Because the lid never lifted, nothing boiled off, and every hour of cooking stayed locked inside the crock. A family could feed a crowd off a single bag of dried beans that cost next to nothing, which made this the dish nearly every 1970s crock-pot cookbook opened with. 24. Hungarian goulash. Ground beef chili gets all the attention today, but in plenty of 1970s households, goulash was the stretch-the-budget dinner that actually showed up on the table. Cubes of chuck roast got browned hard in a skillet first, because nothing caramelizes inside a slow cooker, and that crust was where the flavor lived. The paprika went into the same hot pan before the tomatoes joined it, letting the spice toast instead of turning flat and dusty. Everything then moved into the crock with crushed tomatoes, green pepper, and onion, and simmered low for the better part of 7 hours. Families served it over wide egg noodles, and no two versions tasted quite the same, because every household that had immigrated from Central Europe defended its own recipe as the only correct one. 23. Chicken cacciatore. Long before jarred marinara became a pantry staple, a 1970s home cook built her own tomato mushroom sauce from scratch and let the crock-pot do the heavy lifting. Bone-in chicken thighs got dredged and browned first, then layered into the pot with sliced mushrooms, green pepper, canned tomatoes, and a heavy pinch of oregano and basil. 6 hours on low turned the chicken fall-apart tender and reduced the sauce down to something thick enough to cling to spaghetti. It was one of the few dinners on this list that felt vaguely exotic to a lot of American families, a taste of Italian-American cooking that didn't require a trip to a restaurant. Once the microwave made 30-minute jarred sauce dinners possible, the from-scratch version quietly disappeared from most kitchens. 22. Split pea soup with ham hock. This was the dinner built entirely out of leftovers, and it never wasted a scrap of a holiday ham. The bone and hock went into the crock-pot along with dried split peas, diced carrot, celery, and onion, covered in water, and left on low for most of a day while the peas slowly broke down into a thick, almost velvety soup. No thickener was needed because the peas did that work on their own as they cooked apart. By the time the family sat down, the ham hock had given up every bit of its smoky flavor and fell into shreds that stirred right back into the pot. It cost almost nothing beyond a bone. Most households would have thrown away anyway, and it turned one Sunday ham into an entirely separate dinner days later. 21. Crock-pot meatloaf. Meatloaf had always been a nervous dish, prone to drying out the moment an oven ran 5 minutes too hot or a cook got distracted. The slow cooker solved that problem completely. A loaf of ground beef, Breadcrumbs, egg, and minced onion sat directly on a bed of crumpled foil balls, so the rendered fat drained away underneath instead of pooling around the meat. A glaze of ketchup and brown sugar went across the top, and the whole thing cooked low for around 6 hours, with the lid firmly shut. What emerged was noticeably moister than anything that came out of an oven. The glaze baked into a shiny crust, the inside staying tender all the way through. For a working mother, it meant a dish that had once demanded constant checking could now just be started and forgotten. 20. Swiss steak. Round steak was one of the cheapest cuts in a 1970s meat case, precisely because it was tough enough to punish anyone who tried to cook it quickly. Pounded thin and dredged in seasoned flour, it got browned hard in a skillet before moving to the crock-pot, where it was topped with stewed tomatoes, sliced onion, and green pepper. That flour coating thickened into a rich gravy over 7 or 8 hours of low, steady heat, while the meat itself softened into something that pulled apart with a fork. It was proof that patience could substitute for money at the dinner table, turning a cut most people avoided into a Sunday-worthy meal that cost well under $1 a pound. 19. Sauerkraut and kielbasa. In Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Wisconsin kitchens with German, Polish, or Czech roots, this dish meant the whole house smelled like dinner from the moment anyone got home from school. Sliced kielbasa sat on top of a bed of drained sauerkraut with a sliced apple and a spoonful of brown sugar scattered over everything to mellow out the sharpness. Cooked low for around 6 hours, the sausage turned smoky and plump, while the kraut softened into something closer to sweet than sour. It carried an entire immigrant food tradition into a modern American kitchen, letting a grandchild with a full-time job keep a family recipe alive without spending an entire afternoon at the stove. 18. Beef stroganoff. By the middle of the decade, beef stroganoff had stopped being a special occasion dish reserved for company and turned into an ordinary Wednesday dinner, largely thanks to the slow cooker. Strips of beef, sliced onion, and mushrooms browned in a skillet before joining beef broth and a packet of dry onion soup mixed in the pot for about 7 hours on low. The one rule nobody skipped was turning the cooker off and letting it cool for a few minutes before stirring in sour cream, since dairy added straight to a hot crock would split and curdle almost instantly. Served over egg noodles, the sauce came out silky and tangy, the beef falling apart at the slightest pressure from a fork. A dinner that once meant good china, now needing nothing more than a working stovetop skillet to start it off. 17. Chicken and dumplings. Few dishes tested a slow cooker's usefulness the way this one did, because dumplings had always demanded a cook standing right at the stove. Bone-in chicken pieces cooked low for hours with broth, celery, and onion until the meat fell easily off the bone, at which point the meat got shredded and returned to the pot. The cooker then switched to high, and spoonfuls of biscuit dough went across the surface for a final 30 minutes, with the lid left completely undisturbed, since the trapped steam was what actually cooked them through. The result was a broth thickened by the dumplings themselves, pillowy on top and dense underneath. What used to demand a full afternoon of attention now needed only half an hour of it, right at the very end. 16. Stuffed cabbage rolls. For Polish and Czech families across the Midwest, this had always been a dish that ate up an entire Sunday between boiling the cabbage, rolling each leaf by hand, and watching the oven. Softened cabbage leaves were filled with a mix of raw ground beef, cooked rice, and onion, rolled tight, and packed seam-side down into the crock so they couldn't come apart. A tomato sauce sharpened with a little vinegar and sweetened with brown sugar went over the top, and the rolls cooked low for around 7 hours until the cabbage turned soft and sweet. What had once meant giving up most of a weekend now fit inside a Tuesday, letting a recipe that had crossed an ocean keep getting made by grandchildren with full-time jobs and no time to spare. 15. Stuffed green peppers. Summer gardens across the country produced more green peppers than most families knew what to do with, and this dish became the answer. Hollowed-out peppers were packed with a raw mixture of ground beef, already cooked rice, and diced onion, then stood upright shoulder to shoulder in the pot so they held each other in place. The rest of a can of tomato sauce went over the top, before the lid went on for around 6 hours of low, steady cooking. Using rice that was already cooked mattered more than most recipes let on, since raw rice would have soaked up all the moisture and left the filling dry by the time the peppers were done. It turned a garden surplus into dinner without heating up the whole kitchen the way an oven would have. 14. Ham and scalloped potatoes. When a holiday ham was down to its last few slices, this is where the rest of it went. Thin potato rounds were layered into the pot, alternating with diced ham, and a sauce of canned cream of mushroom soup thinned with milk was poured over each layer as it was built, so it soaked all the way to the bottom instead of just sitting on top. Cooked low for roughly 7 hours, the potatoes drank up the creamy sauce, while the ham gave the whole dish its salt and smoke. It required no oven, no watching, and took about 5 minutes to assemble before anyone left the house for the day, turning last week's centerpiece into an entirely new dinner. 13. Company pork chops. This was the dish a lot of families pulled out specifically when guests were coming over, because it looked and tasted far more impressive than the 5 minutes of prep it actually required. Thick-cut pork chops were browned quickly, then layered in the crock-pot, and covered with a mix of canned cream of chicken soup and a little milk. Cooked low for 6 to 7 hours, the chops turned so tender they barely held together, sitting in a thick gravy built almost entirely from a can. It's one of the clearest examples of how 1970s cooking leaned on condensed soup as a shortcut ingredient, turning something that tasted rich and slow-simmered into a dish anyone could pull off on a weeknight. If you grew up eating any of these dinners, drop a comment with which one your family still made the most. And if you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We've still got 12 dinners left, including the one every single home economist at Rival considered the true test of the whole appliance. 12. Glazed ham. Turning an ordinary Sunday into something that felt like a holiday used to require hours of oven time and constant basting. The Crock-Pot cut nearly all of that out. A bone-in ham sat cut side down in the pot, scored across the top in a diamond pattern, so a glaze of brown sugar, mustard, and pineapple juice could sink into the meat instead of sliding off. No water was needed, since the ham released plenty of its own liquid as it cooked low for around 4 hours. The glaze caramelized right into the scored surface, and every slice came out sweet, salty, and glossy. Best of all, it freed up the oven entirely on a day when it was almost certainly needed for something else, like rolls or a pie. 11. Pulled pork barbecue. Not every family had a smoker or even a backyard grill, but that didn't stop them from wanting real barbecue on the table. A pork shoulder rubbed with salt, pepper, and paprika went into the pot fat side up so it could baste itself as the fat rendered down over the day. A small amount of barbecue sauce thinned with vinegar joined it, since the shoulder gave up plenty of its own juices, and too much liquid would have made the whole thing soupy. After roughly 8 hours on low, 2 forks were enough to shred the meat right there in the crock. It never replaced a real smoked shoulder, but it delivered a version close enough that most families never noticed or minded the difference. 10. Brisket dinner. Brisket rewarded patience more than almost anything else on this list, and it punished anyone who tried to rush it. A well-seasoned brisket sat fat side up on a thick layer of sliced onions, which lifted the meat off the bottom of the pot and slowly melted into the sauce as the hours passed. Beef broth came up only about a third of the way, along with a bay leaf, and the whole thing cooked low for 9 to 10 hours before resting and getting sliced against the grain. The result was meat that pulled into soft strands, sitting in a deeply beefy sauce with onions that had all but disappeared into it. It became one of the go-to dishes for a Sunday dinner that needed almost no attention once it went into the pot that morning. 9. Braised short ribs. Short ribs sat in butcher cases for pennies on the pound during the 1970s, mostly because almost nobody had 8 uninterrupted hours to cook them properly on a weeknight. The Crock-Pot changed that math entirely. Ribs were browned hard on every side first. Then the skillet's leftover fat was used to soften onion and garlic before a spoonful of tomato paste got stirred in until it darkened. Beef broth deglazed the pan, scraping up every browned bit, and the whole mixture went over the ribs in the crock for about 8 hours on low. The meat pulled clean away from the bone, and the reduced liquid turned into a dark, glossy sauce worth spooning over anything else on the plate. What had once been considered a restaurant-only cut became a regular Tuesday dinner, almost by accident. 8. Round steak casserole. This was the workhorse dinner of countless 1970s weeknights, built specifically to leave behind exactly one dirty dish. Strips of round steak were dredged in flour and browned quickly, then layered into the crock-pot in a deliberate order. Potatoes and carrots on the bottom where the heat ran hottest, onion above that, beef on top, and a can of tomatoes poured over the whole thing. Root vegetables needed more time than the meat did, so putting them closest to the heat source kept everything finishing at roughly the same time. After about 8 hours on low, it came out hearty and unfussy. Every ingredient soaked through with beefy juice. For a working mother juggling a full-time job, a single pot, and a single cheap cut of meat, solving dinner and cleanup at once was worth more than almost any other convenience in her kitchen. 7. Chinese pepper steak. For a lot of American families in the 1970s, this dish was their very first taste of anything resembling Chinese-American cooking made at home. Strips of beef or pork got browned quickly in a hot skillet before joining sliced celery, onion, soy sauce, and a spoonful of brown sugar in the crock pot for around 6 hours on low. In the final 20 minutes, a can of drained bean sprouts and a cornstarch slurry stirred in to thicken the sauce and bring back a bit of crunch that 6 hours of slow cooking would otherwise have erased. It wasn't authentic by any real measure, but it introduced an entire generation of home cooks to flavors like soy sauce and ginger they might not have tried any other way, served over rice on a night when takeout wasn't yet a regular option in most towns. 6. Chicken a la king. This dish had actually started life decades earlier as fine restaurant fare, the kind of thing served at hotel dining rooms in the 1930s and 40s. And by the 1970s, it had drifted all the way down into an everyday crock-pot dinner. Cubed chicken, sliced mushrooms, and diced pimento simmered low in a sauce built from chicken broth, a little cream, and a butter and flour base, cooking for around 5 to 6 hours until the chicken turned fork tender. Ladled over toast points or puff pastry shells, it let a home cook serve something that still felt a little formal without spending an evening at the stove. It's one of the clearest examples of a once fancy restaurant dish trickling all the way down into ordinary home cooking, only to vanish again once the ingredients it depended on stopped feeling special. Cheese on toast turned into an entire dinner, and the slow cooker solved the one problem that had always ruined it on a stovetop. Grated sharp cheddar, never cubed, went into the pot on low, since cheese heated too quickly would break and turn grainy instead of smooth. A splash of beer or milk joined it, along with a shot of Worcestershire sauce and a pinch of dry mustard, and the whole mixture melted slowly for close to an hour, stirred every 20 minutes or so until it turned thick and glossy. Ladled hot over toast, it was rich enough to nearly feel indulgent for a weeknight. Scorching a cheese sauce on a stovetop took only a moment of distraction, and the slow cooker's low, even heat made that mistake almost impossible. 4 cheap ingredients and a whole afternoon of patience turned into one of the most satisfying dinners on this entire list. A full head of shredded cabbage and 2 thinly sliced onions went into the pot with a stick of butter and several cloves of minced garlic, with no water added at all, since the cabbage released plenty of its own liquid as it broke down. Cooked low for 4 to 5 hours, stirred occasionally, the cabbage collapsed down to a fraction of its original volume and turned golden at the edges. Cooked egg noodles stirred in during the final 20 minutes, finished with a heavy hand of black pepper. It was peasant food in the best possible sense, feeding Polish and Slovak families across the industrial Midwest for generations on almost nothing, and the crock-pot kept it going long after the grandmothers who first made it were gone. This was cold weather food from the German Midwest, and it needed exactly the kind of long, slow cooking that most weeknights simply didn't allow. Country-style spare ribs were browned first. Then the pot was built in careful layers, sauerkraut and shredded cabbage on the bottom, and the ribs laid across the top rather than buried inside it, since the acid in the kraut would otherwise pull all the moisture out of the meat and leave it stringy. A spoonful of brown sugar and a pinch of caraway went over everything before roughly 7 hours on low. The pork turned meltingly tender, while the kraut mellowed into something closer to sweet than sharp, filling the whole house with a smell that meant supper was already handled. More than almost any other dish on this list, pot roast is what convinced a generation of skeptical cooks that this strange countertop appliance actually worked. A chuck roast got seared hard on every side, in a screaming hot skillet first, since the crock-pot itself couldn't brown anything, and skipping that step left the finished dish tasting flat and gray. Quartered potatoes, carrots, and onion went into the bottom of the pot with the roast set on top, along with a packet of dry onion soup mix and just a single cup of broth, since almost nothing evaporated under that sealed lid the way it would on a stovetop. Cooked low for around 8 hours, the meat pulled apart with barely any pressure from a fork, the vegetables soaking up beef juices the entire time. It asked almost nothing of the cook and delivered a dinner that tasted like it had been tended all day, filling the house with the smell of a Sunday dinner on an ordinary Wednesday. Here's what almost nobody talks about when they bring up the 1970s Crock-Pot boom. It was never really about the appliance itself. It was a direct answer to one very specific, very new problem. By 1970, roughly 40% of married women in America were working outside the home, a number that kept climbing through the decade. Dinner still needed to be on the table by 6 o'clock, but the old assumption behind homemade cooking, a woman standing at the stove for most of the afternoon, had simply stopped being true for millions of households at once. Rival's own advertising said the quiet part out loud, urging women to cook all day while the cook's away. It wasn't sold as a shortcut. It was sold as permission to leave the house in the morning and still put a real dinner on the table that night. These dishes didn't disappear because they stopped tasting good. They disappeared because trusting a pot to cook dinner alone for 8 hours without anyone home to check on it eventually stopped feeling necessary. Of every dinner the Crock-Pot ever made possible, this is the one people still talk about decades later, and Rival's own longtime test kitchen home economists were known to say that a good beef stew was the single dish that truly proved the appliance's worth to a skeptical household. Chuck roast, cut into large cubes and dredged in seasoned flour, was browned hard in batches, never crowding the skillet because crowding the pan steams meat instead of searing it, and that crust was where nearly all the flavor started. The beef then joined quartered potatoes, thick-cut carrots, celery, and onion in the crock, with just enough beef broth poured in to barely cover everything. Covered and cooked low for 8 to 10 hours, the flour left over from dredging thickened the broth entirely on its own. No cornstarch or extra roux ever required. What came out the other end was exactly what stew was always supposed to be. Meat falling into soft shreds, vegetables tender enough to cut with the edge of a spoon, a gravy thick and deeply savory, tasting like it had simmered patiently all day, because it genuinely had. It wasn't regional. It didn't belong only to New England or the Midwest or the South. A pot of beef stew started before work and finished by supper looked the same on tables in nearly every state in the country, which is exactly why it sits at the very top of this list. It was never fancy, and it never needed to be. It was simply the dish that proved a humble little countertop cooker, built from a decades-old design nobody had wanted, could genuinely feed an entire country, one working family at a time. We didn't lose it because it stopped tasting good. We lost it the moment speed became more important than the 8 quiet hours it used to take to get it right. And most of us never noticed the trade we'd made until dinner stopped smelling like anything by the time we walked in the door. Which one of these 25 dinners is still on your family's weekly rotation? And which one do you wish would make a comeback? Let us know down in the comments. And if you want to see the 20 dinners we couldn't fit on this list, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss part 2.